but quality house, and building Loud Light, and sort of where we're at politically in Kansas. And then I'm, more than happy to get to Q&A and talk about whatever you want to hear about. Whenever I was 22 years old, I'm originally from North Florida. I was in New York City at the time working for a nonprofit called Planning Peace. And I sort of pitched the opportunity to come to Kansas, which I did not know where it was even on a map. I just knew it was in the middle somewhere. And to come here and go paint a house directly across the street from the most infamous hate group of sort of like the modern era in the United States, and paint it rainbow and do LGBTQ advocacy from there. Really, there wasn't much planned beyond painting the house. That was sort of like the plan, and then we were like, let's see what happens. So I came to Kansas, frankly, in many ways, afraid. I had a lot of stereotypes about what Kansas would be like. And when I got here, a lot of those stereotypes were immediately challenged. I found a way more welcoming environment. I also found that everyone I was talking to didn't agree with what was happening in the state at this time. So this is 2013. This is really sort of at the rise of the Brownback administration, who came in, elected in 2010, was coming in 2011. And so I came in when we're about 2 years into the Brownback administration. Actually seeing y'all's legislative priorities, there's so many of those that in isolation might not make sense, but if you really think back to what was happening in the Brownback years, it makes a lot of sense. For example, funding for the arts. When I first moved here too, I remember even just reading the Wikipedia page about Brownback and being sort of surprised about how this was sort of a horror story for a modern state and humanity. And the arts point was that under the Brownback administration, Kansas was the first state to ever just completely defund arts, defund public support for the arts. That was reversed because there was a public outcry, but those are things that we sort of forget about and take for granted about how not just extreme, but like bizarrely extreme, unusual for even more conservative ideology. It was so far to the right. And so I came here, we painted the house. Painting the house was like hands down the best day of my life. Had thousands of people visit, and we didn't know how it would go, and it was really this thing that meant we made this symbol, but we thought we knew what it meant to us, but finding out what it meant to so many other people was a really special experience in my life. I lived in that house for 5 years. And so having people knock at the door and I answer and they're just crying because it's such a sort of powerful and spiritual moment for them, because they've had, a sibling who has died and had Westboro Baptist Church protest their funeral. Also, we had tons of sort of military community support, because the Westboro Baptist Church was not only attacking LGBTQ people, but attacking military folks. And so it was this unusual experience of often having sort of very queer events too. We would have sometimes drag shows on the lawn to raise money for causes. We did creative activism, Mike Pence, who was then governor of Indiana, was defunding, I believe he was defunding HIV and AIDS programs. And so we had a thing where anyone who would donate money to this fund would get an Easter egg and an Easter basket, and then a drag queen would deliver the Easter basket to Mike Pence's office. And it ended up raising, tens of thousands of dollars for the Indianapolis HIV AIDS program. We even did things when Robin Williams died. The Westboro Baptist Church protest because of his roles in the birdcage as a gay person, or even Mrs. Doubtfire. And so we did a big counter-protest fundraiser, and I think raised over $200,000 for St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, which was his favorite charity. And a lot of the goal there was taking something that people see, and because we live in such a sort of violent culture and society, so many times we see something we don't like, and our urge is like violence and revenge, and trying to take that feeling and sort of like a jujitsu thing, transition it into, can you put your energy into something that's not only productive and good and helping people who are hurt, but that's really undermining the power of the people who are doing the hurting. Like, no, they're not this hate group, there's this outrageous, ridiculous group that really shouldn't have so much power over us. So that's how I got here in the work I was doing. Then in 2014, my background is in political science, and in 2014, there was the re-election of Brownback. And that year, it was Sam Brownback versus Paul Davis, and it was a very tight election. Mm-hmm. And Sam Brownback was at the time the most unpopular governor in the entire country. And a lot of people thought that election, Brownback was not going to win it. And then he won by, I think it was just under 40,000 votes. It was a very small margin. What's interesting about that is if you really, following that, I started looking at all the election data. What I found that in 2011, Kansas had passed this big voter security package called the SAFE Act that Chris Kobach, then the Secretary of State, had pushed. It included a variety of what we know as voter suppression tactics, including something that required you to prove your citizenship to get registered to vote. And it wasn't just showing a birth certificate. It was that you had to have a certified copy of your birth certificate, and you had to get it not just presented at the DMV or anything, you had to get it to your county clerk. What's especially outrageous about this is that Kobach sold this to the legislature by saying that there's tons of people illegally voting. There's undocumented folks who are illegally voting. There's all this voter fraud. Our voter rolls are filled with people who shouldn't be registered. But the bill did not require that everyone prove their citizenship. It only required that new registrants prove their citizenship. Of course, the irony here is he's saying people are illegally voting, but he's grandfathering them into a protected class. And he's just saying that it will now be extremely difficult for new people, which is predominantly young people. It is predominantly people who have moved to the state, or people who are from communities who have been historically disenfranchised and might be receiving outreach for the first time to get registered to vote. That essentially what it did is it froze the electorate. It was essentially a law that said, we like the people who could vote in 2012, and we're going to make it damn near impossible for any new people to start voting.
What was that called again?
It was called the SAFE Act.
SAFE Act.
And the policy was called DPOC, or Documentary Proof of Citizenship. So under this, what we now know is about 40,000 people at the time of the 2014 election were blocked from voting, right? We're blocked from not just voting, from being registered to vote. This did make its way through the courts through a long series of years, and ultimately it was struck down as unconstitutional, as violating the U.S. Constitution. At federal district court, the state tried to appeal it, the appeals court upheld it, and they even tried to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to even hear the case and let the appeals court ruling stand. The reason I start out with that is to say that Brownback's 2014 election, he was re-elected under an unconstitutional voter suppression scheme that we know was probably blocking about the number of people that was his margin of victory. Can I say that he would have lost if that law was in place? No, I can't. But I can say that those numbers create, the numbers are there. And this is an ongoing thing that we have seen and that I fight in the legislature every year about, is that there are more and more voter suppression policies, and that if you really dig into them, a lot of the most egregious ones are, in everything but name, they are targeting young people to block them from getting registered to vote or from being able to participate in elections. So at this time, and I'm, you know, starting to understand these voter suppression laws and look into them, I also, in the 2014 election, it made me realize something pretty shocking, which is that Kansas actually has one of the younger populations in the entire country. We're a state that has a very youthful population, and it doesn't feel that way at all because we don't see young people engaged in our civic life. And there's a lot of barriers about that, from voter suppression to, you know, the unique economic hardships that many like young people over the last 15 years have come up to, including like saddled with student debt, all these other things that make it very difficult to choose to use your time to engage in public civic events and elections, participating in candidate forums, running for office yourself. There's so many economic barriers right now on the new generation of Americans in Kansas that block them. But in Kansas, there's also specific laws that often block them from engaging. But not only did Kansas have, you know, this really high youth population, but it had one of the lowest youth voter turnouts in the nation in that 2014 election. Again, in large part, in addition to societal, cultural, economic issues, was these voter suppression laws that were specifically targeting young people and blocking them from voting. I think it was like over half of the people who were impacted by that law were people under 30, were being blocked from registering to vote. So when I looked at it, and you know, I was coming at this from an angle of coming here on LGBTQ issues, but you know, whenever you look at polling data, we know that young folks are, you know, the most likely to be passionate about LGBTQ issues, about environmental issues, about a variety of issues. And when they are systemically blocked from participating, we don't actually have a real democracy. We have a distorted picture of what the people, you know, what the citizenry of a place, how they actually feel, who actually represents them. And so I thought, you know, the number one thing that needed to happen in that context was that just more young people needed to be registered to vote, needed to be brought into the system. So in 2015, I decided to leave Planning Peace and the Quality House and create Loud Light with the number one goal of registering young people to vote, of trying to fix this gap. We have a very young population, but most of our young folks aren't participating. When I started doing that, it was, you know, to be frank, it was mostly on a hope and a prayer. And there was like no money. I was still doing some stuff for like the Quality House to be able to just like live. And for, you know, about 2 years, it was really just kind of me running around on college campuses by myself, sometimes with volunteers, trying to register young people to vote. And this was under the context of that documentary proof of citizenship law. So I would try to register someone to vote. And you know, you think you're done, you filled out the form, you check the boxes, you know, you signed your affidavit, you're done, right? No, now we'd have to be like, all right, now we need a plan for you to find a certified copy of your birth certificate and get it to your county clerk, you know, and they're like, what the hell is a county clerk? So I quickly found myself essentially having to act like a caseworker. I mean, there are young people at that period where, I mean, I had spreadsheets where I'd have to track my contact with them, help explain to them, you know, hey, I was born in California, but my family, you know, when I was 5 years old, I moved to Kansas. My family doesn't know where my birth certificate is, or I'm estranged from my family. How do I get this? I'm like, you know, you're gonna have to go figure out online, like how to contact the state agency. I even had young folks I was working with who would, you know, ask me about it. They're like, is this right? And I realized they're about to like give their credit card information to a scamming website that's trying to like impersonate a government website. Like these are weird obstacles that they were coming up against. And then they would have to, when they finally find the right state agency to request it from, then they would often have to pay, you know, $40, $50 to request it. If that's the barrier, that's a poll tax. That is a poll tax. You're having to pay money to be able to even get registered to vote in that context. And then they have to wait, you know, 4 to 6 weeks to get their birth certificate. And here I am just to register a single voter, following over the course of, sometimes 4 months, talking to them a dozen times to get one person registered to vote. And it's like, that's the obstacles we were up against. So we were doing that, and then there's a lot of other things we got involved in, but on this specific issue, the courts eventually did strike it down as unconstitutional voter suppression. And then so you were able to use the form, just like the state form, fill it out and get registered. Then Chris Kobach did stuff where he tried to be like, well, if you fill out the state form, you still have to provide documentary proof of citizenship. And there were all these legal battles that spun out in all these ways because Chris Kobach kept on trying to find new and new nuanced ways of reading the court rulings and be like, well, I can still block young people from voting this way. All of those ended up getting struck down. Also at this time, now in 2017, I met Brian McClendon, who had run for Secretary of State in 2018, the guy who made Google Earth. And he asked to talk to me, and he was like, what's the number one sort of issue in democracy? And I was like, for Kansas, we don't really have an online registration system because it requires a state-issued ID. And a lot of young people here, college students, have a right to vote in our state, but they might not have like an in-state driver's license. And a lot of low-income folks do not have an in-state issued by the DMV license. And so there is something called a federal form from federal law, federal voter registration form. And when I was talking to Brian McClendon about it, I was like, I think that you could make a digital federal form. That you could design this so that someone can just sign on their phone and submit it, and then it will protect you from all these voter suppression efforts by the state because it becomes a federal form issue. And that's where ksvotes.org comes from. Brian McClendon and all of his, tech capabilities, helps get this site built out, and now ksvotes.org comes on the scene, and now on your phone in 2 minutes you can get registered to vote, and you have like your voter registration has federal protections. And that ends up unleashing this era where, tens of thousands of young people start getting registered to vote by that. Because again, you can just pull out your phone and do it in a minute to 2 minutes. We start to grow our light. We start to have, be able to hire more people, have people on the ground registering voters all throughout the state. In 2017 also is the year that, one of the most common issues that we run into is, and I'm sure many of y'all have ran into this, you ask a young person to register to vote and they're like, why? Like, my vote doesn't matter. And I would talk about, I'm like, sure, your vote doesn't matter for president, right? You're probably not going to change the outcome for that. But did you know, your state representative, many across Kansas, they won by 50 votes. We usually have 5 or 6 races that, win by sometimes a vote, right? Like tiny margins. And those are the people who are setting your college tuition. And that is what's deciding how much debt you're in the rest of your life. That you do have power on this. But then I realized most people don't even understand what the state government is. If you ask people who their state representative is, you get any answer, most of the time they'll tell you they're congressperson. They do not understand that there is like an entire federal system, an entire state system.
That's so sad.
And it's by the way, this is not just young people. You'd be surprised just how many people of any age, any economic status, any level of education don't understand that we have sort of, our state legislature that has a Senate and a House. And why would they? Because also at this point, if you think back to 2015 to 2017, this was when, everything goes online. Every news agency puts up paywalls. So there's really no free way to get accurate news. This is before the Kansas Reflector, any of these things. And if you wanted to have information, everything was a sign up at that point. Every news agency, every article, you had to pay to view. And so we decided to start making weekly recap videos. At first it wasn't even a plan to do it all the time. The first week of the 2017 session, I post up in the corner. It's a very crappy video. And it's just like, here's the things that happen in the State House. And part of why I wanted to make that video is the big argument going into that year was the state had $1 billion deficit and they were deciding what to cut. And one of the things that they were thinking about doing was, we have from the big tobacco settlement of the 90s, where all the states sued big tobacco and got a huge settlement that's paid out every year. Kansas did something that was sort of amazing during the Sebelius years, which they secured all that money into a fund. So all the lawsuit money goes into a fund, and all of that money has to be spent on young children initiatives. And these are the sort of programs that, you know, a child is born with a condition where if they get physical therapy early on while they're an infant, it could prevent them from having a disability the rest of their life, right? Like, these are interventions that maybe cost money early on, but can change the trajectory of kids' lives. Like, that's the sort of money that these programs were funding. And Brownback was going to securitize it, which essentially means he would sell off all those payments to some private company and just get one lump sum to cover the deficit for 1 year, which would mean all of those children programs, the reality is they would all be shut down. And a form of funding that would like secure these children's programs would just be gone to be one-time stopgap to plug the deficit, just part of the deficit for 1 year. And there were so many discussions like that I was like, people need to know what's going on, like the consequences of this. And so I made the video, and to my surprise, it just blew up. Like, there was such a desire for information in a concise way. So we started making the video every single week. And since then, surprising things have happened too, where it brings a lot of people into the issues, and it gives them agency even when they go to a town hall with their state representative or someone like that, because they actually know what's going on. And we started to make explainer videos. Actually, I know y'all are going to have the Legal Women Voters talk about campaign, or about how we fund K through 12 education in the state. You know, we had done a big video explaining like the details of that, explaining the details of what does it mean for the state to be $1 billion in deficit? Like, how did we get here? In putting out these details, and those things give people agency to actually confront their legislators, to actually engage in conversations where they have information that gives them the power to push back on their legislators, instead of just, you know, being in a position where your legislator says something you know feels wrong, but you don't have any way to counteract it. And that was about giving the citizenry agency to engage in policy discussions. So that's sort of where the videos come about. Then, as we were growing, building staff, starting to have a statewide presence, we started finding ourselves doing more and more lobbying in the State House because we had more and more voter suppression bills coming up. And then really following the 2020 election, where, you know, the big lie, the Trump election fraud conspiracy comes about, and just a wave of terrible voter suppression bills come through. Like,
who's funding those mostly?
I mean, frankly, most of it comes from like the Koch family network and like related folks to that. And even, for example, one of the biggest groups pushing voter suppression bills in Kansas, it's called Opportunity Solutions Project, which is, it's a group that for years, their actual policy concern is they're sort of like an anti-public assistance group. For years, they've been in the state pushing, blocking, like they are a key force of why Kansas doesn't have Medicaid expansion. They're an anti-public assistance group. And so, but only after 2020. So in 2021, they start calling themselves an election integrity group. And a lot of their voter suppression bills are geared towards blocking low-income folks from being able to get registered to vote or participate in the election process. Often in the State House, actually, you'll have a voter suppression bill. You'll have, you know, us and other advocacy groups in the state, and I mean dozens of Kansas opposing the bill, and the only supporters, the only people speaking in support is Opportunity Solutions Project, an out-of-state, like think tank, anti-poor group, and the bill just flies through. the only bills that have been stopped in this regard really have been Governor Kelly has vetoed them, and then they have been unable to override the veto. But in some cases, they have overridden the veto, and one of those was they made a bill that expanded what impersonating an election official is, and it made it so that it's illegal for me to tell you, I'm Scott Schwab or something like that, to say I'm the Secretary of State. Of course, that's illegal. They said it's illegal it's not just illegal, it's a felony crime to engage in activity that is like perceived to be that like conduct of an election official. Well, from our perspective, I've been doing voter registration drives, and it's not completely uncommon for someone to ask if we're with the Secretary of State's office, if we're with the county clerk's office, because they're just like, that's who registers voters, right? It's a harmless mistake. But now it's something that our understanding is that we could be charged with a felony. So we sued over that, and now it's been, over 2 years where we've ceased voter registration. For example, same
with legal women voters.
Same with legal women voters who are also, they're involved in the lawsuit with us. But that bill was not just pushed by Opportunity Solutions Project, it was actually pushed by anti-abortion groups. And it was pretty explicitly designed, again, to try to make it harder for people to vote before the abortion constitutional amendment. That was on the August ballot explicitly to try to, in hopes of reducing turnout.
Sure.
There were so many other efforts, that's why they even passed a law that we're also suing over, that makes it a felony crime if you assist more than 10 people in returning their mail ballot. Explicitly, that was designed because they thought then folks would go out and help folks vote to protect, the right to reproductive care. Like, these laws are very intentionally designed to block specific people from voting that they think will not agree with them. And so we have that voter suppression bill, and under this context, we're starting to get to we get in the pandemic, and in 2020, we still managed to register nearly 10,000 people to vote. And now they pass a law that makes it a felony crime for us to register voters. And so, while we are suing on that, and any Friday now, we expect a ruling on the voter registration case. It's in front of the Kansas Supreme Court. They heard arguments on it, I think the end of January, the beginning of February. I feel pretty good about that, but you never know what you're going to get from courts. So that's also, when I told you before that under this documentary proof of citizenship thing, there was 5 or 6 years where Kansas unconstitutionally was blocking voter registration, and now we're over 2 years through Kansas again unconstitutionally blocking not people from even voting, people from getting registered to vote. Which I say all this to be like, when we talk about, how extreme Kansas is or whatever, it's so important to say Kansas has not experienced in the last decade, what our democracy actually looks like. There has been systematic efforts to distort our democracy. And so under this heading of building an inclusive democracy, you have to, sort of confront the fact that it's not just about, how do we bring more people in. It's that there are explicit barriers designed to prevent more people from being brought into civic life. And so in that context, we started doing more organizing, more community organizing, because sort of out of necessity, we were like, well, we can't register voters, so what are we gonna do? And that leads to now we have a lot of organizers. For example, the candidate forum that's coming up later today. Donovan Dillon, organizer we have in Lawrence, who is also involved in getting the Crown Act passed to make it illegal racial discrimination based on hair, helping to get that passed. But it's not just about, when we talk about community organizing too in this context, civic life is not just voting. Yes, voting is an important thing, but it's sort of the bare minimum. And while on one hand, we're fighting for people to even have access to do the bare minimum of being involved in civic life, what we really want On the other hand, is we want a robust civic life. We want people of all types and stripes to be engaged in community conversations and to be a part of those decisions, to make those decisions legitimate. Like, that is the promise of democracy, is that on one day, every single person is equal and gets to cast one vote on deciding our direction, and that on every day, everyone's voice can be heard on trying to influence the outcome of what our decision makers do. So on the community organizing aspect, it's not just about, if there's a policy like the Crown Act here or candidate forums. It's about people bringing people together, and they have community action teams, and getting people to really start to think about, what power do I have? What power do we have to try to change our community in the way that we believe in? How do you make a map for that? How do you go from a good idea you have to actually a plan that can make it, a law or a city ordinance? How do you power map things like sitting there and saying, well, what motivates everyone on the city commission? Like, why do they feel the ways they do about these issues? Are they motivated by their faith? Are they motivated by data? Are they motivated by, their own life experience? How can we as a team make a strategy to get them to see why we're so passionate about this issue and think there needs to be an ordinance to address it? And that kind of thing of building, sort of giving that to people, giving them the experience of being a part of actually making a plan for change, and even, achieving change or stopping something bad from happening in their community. That is not just an end of itself. That's the sort of stuff that builds a better community. People who understand these things, people who are passionate and thinking through, like, how do we build a healthier community? I now have the skills, I can give those to other people. That's what creates a healthy democracy, and that's what creates a more legitimate democracy. Sorry, I know that was a lot and kind of all over the place, and there is.
That's good.
There is, I guess actually before I open it up, one other thing I'll say about the organizing efforts is something we've been building for years, the last couple of years, is even, we do stuff statewide, but in Southwest Kansas, there's a young person that I actually met him when he was 17 in high school because he contacted me and wanted to learn how to register to vote. And now, Alejandro, he then went to KU, and now he's graduated and he works for Loud Light. He runs a program called New Frontiers, which was really about his desire to go back to Dodge City and try to build up the civics of the community, particularly like the Hispanic and Latina community that he was from, and that he felt like he didn't have that community there. And now he's there organizing in ways not just to, when they'll be able to, hopefully after we get a ruling from the court, be able to register voters, but be able to bring people sort of out of their homes and into civic life, build representation in their own community. Alejandro is actually involved in a lawsuit against the city of Dodge City because, they have all at-large city council districts, which through New Frontiers, they actually did write a report showing the racist origins of that. It was basically explicitly because more and more people of color were coming to the community, and they wanted to make sure that they couldn't build political power on their city council. And so they made all the districts at large, and lo and behold, like the entire city council is white, even though it is a majority minority community, like nearly a super majority minority community, yet all of their leaders are white folks. And so they are suing over to have proportional districts so that it's actually where the communities are, divided into districts so that people can actually have representation for their neighborhood. And so that's also about like long-term power building. It's not just that these things sort of magically happen. And it's not even like when we talk about the extremes of the Brownback administration, it's not like that magically happened. I mean, you can look at research and even research books about through the 80s and 90s, what is essentially like a Christian fascist intentional effort to try to essentially take over our government to implement like Christo-fascist policies, which is much of what we even experienced in the Brownback administration. But that didn't happen overnight. That was a concerted effort of decades. And if we want to have a robust, healthy democracy where everyone does get to be heard, everyone does have access to the ballot box, everyone does have the ability to have their voice heard at the decision-making table, that is a decades-long process. So Brendan, earlier when you joked about, you're like, we're not doing too great on some of the mission state policies, it's because often we are fighting for a legitimate, inclusive democracy. Folks who have fought to undermine that have been, in Kansas it's been concerted for decades, but it's also been, and frankly, a part of this nation and state's history since the beginning. We are trying to reach an ideal that was promised to us in a society, in a government structure that was often designed to say that ideal, but never actually live that ideal. And the reason I say that is from the origins of, white male landowners to the access to the ballot box we have today, and still the voter suppression we're fighting every day today. I mentioned I'm from Florida. In my entire life, Florida still had a Jim Crow policy my entire life, which was that it blocked anyone who had a felony conviction from ever being able to vote in their life, right? Actually, it was before the 2016 election. The last conversation I had with my oldest brother before he died was he was asking me how to register to vote. And I told him, because he had had a felony conviction before, I told him, I'm sorry, man, you're never going to be allowed to vote in Florida because of that law. What that law did is it overwhelmingly blocked predominantly black folks and predominantly black males from voting, right? And it distorts what we even think of as Florida. Many people think of Florida as a state that's become very conservative and everything, but you have to understand it's a state that's been systemically disenfranchising voters forever, right? And continues to do so today. And in 2018, the people of Florida finally passed a constitutional amendment saying we're done with this, felony disenfranchisement is over. Once people have their rights restored, they're able to register and vote again. And the conservative legislature immediately went and started passing more and more barriers to make that something that is an ideal on paper, but not a reality for people, to block people from voting. I mean, if you look at, a lot of people just have a misconception about the people of the United States of America. Even look at Alabama, look at Mississippi. I have friends who run an organization called Mississippi Votes, which is especially geared towards helping to mobilize and engage Black women there. Mississippi has the highest percentage population of Black folks in the country. Yet it's this state that really is unresponsive to the needs of that community. Why? Well, you look at all the systemic voter suppression. Mississippi has bizarre policies that seem bureaucratic and nuanced when you talk about it, but when you actually look at the impact, it's designed to prevent the Black folks in Mississippi from actually having any representation in power in the state.
Gerrymandering too.
Explicitly with the gerrymandering. Even in Kansas, and we were involved in the lawsuit against the congressional districts being gerrymandered. I mean, that stuff is so egregious how they cut Wyandotte County in half. I mean, it is, and not only in half, so I sat through that entire trial. We were plaintiffs in that trial, so all the expert reports as they were showing, even how the interstate was built through Wyandotte was designed to segregate and divide, communities of color. And they show the history of that and intention behind that. We know a lot of the highway and interstate system, they were basically it's plowing through communities of color. I mean, even in Topeka, there used to be a prosperous Black area of downtown that was plowed through by how they designed the interstate. But those historic injustices then that's now the line they use to divide it, right? To gerrymander this community again. And even on the state level, on the state legislative maps, we submitted stuff to the Kansas Supreme Court about that. And unfortunately, they upheld the maps. I have a lot of thoughts about that. But the thing is, like, the districts, both our federal, but especially our state districts, they are partisan gerrymandered. It's not like the Kansas Supreme Court did not say these are not partisan gerrymandered, they're okay. They said we can't do anything about it. The Kansas lives in a gerrymandered state legislature that is pretty explicitly designed to protect incumbents, which essentially means to protect the Republican supermajority in the state. And so all of these things, again, make it so our government does not look and does not reflect the values of our people. Like the people of Lawrence, I'm sure, are better than its government. The people of Kansas are for sure better than its government. And the people of the United States of America are better than the government we actually see there, because the people, so many of them that are critical parts of our electorates, that are critical perspectives, are blocked from participating. And so when we talk about building a more inclusive democracy, we have to talk about the barriers that are in place now. We have to talk about the systemic injustices and systemic barriers that have blocked people from participating. And then we have to talk about efforts to actually proactively bring people in, give them a seat at the table, build power within their community. Because, I sit here as, a white man before you. There's been a lot of investment to build power in my own, demographic community over the course of our nation's history, but not enough effort to give everyone an equal footing at the state, give everyone an equal voice in our policies. And so I think that's a lot of the work we're doing, which, as bizarre as it feels when people say like, oh, this is progressive, or this is like leftist work, and I'm like, then you think the US Constitution is progressive and leftist, then you think like the ideals and purpose of this entire nation is leftist and progressive. Like, all we want is to actually experience a real democracy, to see what that looks like and feels like in our lifetime. So with that, I'm happy to open it up for questions about anything.
How much of a force is ALEC still, as far as creating legislation that gets passed on to legislators and at the state level all over the United States?
So ALEC is still quite powerful. So ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. It is essentially like a policy mill pushing shop, and what they do is, like, for example, Koch Industries, the Koch families, the Koch family has been really involved in this, which is it's an organization that, Koch Industries, but other folks like Walmart, private prisons, other people like that give them money. They craft bill templates that advance the people who funded them. For example, like, how do you make sure that more people get arrested and put in private prisons? They make these bills, and then they bring legislators around the country, often state legislators, to big schwanky resorts, and they spend a weekend, getting wined and dined and taken to, and having presentations about why this bill is great, and then strategizing with each other of how they're going to get passed. Former Kansas Senate President Susan Wagle was on the executive board, I believe, there. And it's not even like this stuff is like hidden. Their meetings are very private and hidden and stuff, but the concepts are very clear, and you see these bills pop up, all across the country. Kansas has, we've seen the private prison type stuff. We've seen all sorts of tax reform being pushed by ALEC, but it's how, if you're a private jet manufacturer and you want to make sure that billionaires and millionaires can write off their private jet of their taxes on their state taxes, you go to ALEC, you say, I want to make it really cheap for rich people to buy it, and I want the people of the state to essentially pay for the private jet for the person, and then the state legislators get wine and dine, they go back, they pass the bill, and lo and behold, now the billionaire gets to write all of their private jet off of their taxes. And it's, on all sorts of issues, some of them like tax issues, as I said, some of them egregious things like trying to extend how much time people have to serve just so that a private prison company can get more money. Trying to make contracts with private prison companies that say the state must make sure that every bed in the private prison is filled, or the state pays a fine for not arresting enough people, like just bizarre stuff.
You build it, they will come.
Yeah, so that is there in policy shops. Like there's ALEC is one, but there are other ones. And I deal with this voter suppression bills where Heritage Foundation and other conservative groups like that again bring in state lawmakers, and then we see the same bill pop up all across the country. All the anti-trans bills are a great example. All the weird public education bills are another example. Most of that stuff is coordinated, and it is frustrating lobbying in the state house because you have someone flying from out of state, they present this, and sometimes the bills just don't even make sense for our state, right? Like this is crafted as a template, and sometimes they're talking about policies where I'm like, we don't even do that here, right? Like this doesn't make sense. Like these legislators in even these think tanks, like they're just pushing this policy because that's what they get they get paid to push the policy.
Experts are ridiculous too. They're not even experts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They do not understand they're sales folks, right? Like this is like sort of like pharma sales people, the lobbyists of these big groups. They just come in, all they know how to do is push their points. They do not understand how election works. They do not understand how prisons work. They do not understand any of this. They just have a sales pitch to come in and get it passed. And all too often those types of bills do get passed in Kansas.
Is Loudly a Kansas organization?
Yeah. So all of our work is in Kansas. I will say there's a funny thing where, because on Opportunity Solutions Project, they're like, they are a Florida-based group. Technically, Loud Light is incorporated in Florida, but as I said, when we were founded, I was visiting my parents for Christmas. And so I did the filing paperwork there. Also because at the time, this is when Chris Kobach was Secretary of State. Chris Kobach was extremely focused on chasing like imaginary voter fraud and was like not really focused on administering the Secretary of State's office. So in that decade that he was in office, really from 2010 to 2018, this is when a lot of the tech stuff was coming out, where a lot of states were improving, for example, their business registration system and stuff like that, making it so you could file online. And in Kansas, at the time, like Kobach didn't prioritize that stuff, it wasn't happening. And I was like, gosh, it takes you have to do all this you have to do paperwork, and then it gets mailed back and forth if there's an error or whatever. And I was like, states like Florida had it where you could just submit online in 5 minutes, and if there's an error, you just get an email back and you fix it and you're done. And I just wanted to get it done, so I incorporated there. But all of our work is based out of here. But I felt like explaining that because also some conservatives are not trying to attack us on that. And I'm like, all right, sorry, I was visiting my parents for Christmas. I'm gonna get this done.
And it was easier, quicker.
Yeah.
I heard a good clip on public radio about everything they're getting done in Minnesota. Do you know about, and it's community organizing. Granted, they have a House and a Senate and a governor of the same political stream, so that makes it easier to actually get something done, but they also have a lot of community organizing work and community involvement. But I can't remember, I was driving and I don't know, I don't know the name of the organization or anything about it. Do you know anything about it?
So they were talking about a specific organization.
Well, they
in
were,
Minnesota?
but it doesn't mean.
So it could be, did they do stuff like what I'm describing?
Yeah,
so was it called the Minnesota Youth Collective? Because there's lots of groups in every state, right? But I do know one that folks that I know there that are called the Minnesota Youth Collective that do a lot of stuff around.
I think it might have been involving churches, but it wasn't just Christian churches. They were involving churches of other faith, Hindus and Muslim communities and so on. So, but anyway, I was really impressed with all the stuff that they have gotten done during in this political climate.
Yeah, and I mean, I think they have a trifecta, meaning that they have the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, but by like a tiny margin. But I don't know that specific group. I will say on interfaith work, you know, Kansas has Kansas Interfaith Action, led by Rabbi Modi Reber, which does a lot of that incredible work in the State House, often bringing like different faith perspectives to lawmakers, which I think is really important and critical work.
See the one that talked at Equality Day?
Yes.
He was awesome.
Yes. Rabbi Modi Reber
He's
is
hilarious.
yeah. And that's really, he used to do stuff mostly on environmental stuff from a faith perspective about being stewards, you know, to the creation. But now he speaks on a lot of issues, and it is both really powerful having him in the State House and hearing him speak, but it's wild because, for example, I saw gun sense legislation is on y'all's legislative priorities. You know, you have Rabbi Modi will get up there and read like the official sort of different faiths' official position on gun policy, you know, which is often like sensible regulations. I mean, guns are killing so many people every year. I mean, we actually had over the last 5 years, the amount of young people in Kansas that are killed by guns has doubled. I think last recorded data from 2021, more young people died by guns than by cars in Kansas. I mean,
All over the
Number
country.
one cause of death.
yeah, number one cause of death of young people here. And so anyway, so we have some different groups on different perspectives doing stuff, but also like states like Minnesota and others have had some of this effort for decades. Like again, like, you know, legislators, politicians, I should say, we strongly believe that politicians are not proactive about anything. Politicians react to things, and it's our job as, you know, as organizers, as engaged citizens, to give them something to react to, right? To give them some agitation. It's like, no, you need to confront this issue. You need to do something about this, because they won't just do it on their own. Like nothing in the State House just magically happens and floats through. Like people push to make it happen. And I would also say though, I don't know all the details about Minnesota, but you know, for anyone who's not familiar, like we do have, you know, we have a Democratic governor, but we have on the other side, we have a super majority Republican House and a super majority Republican Senate, meaning 2 out of 3 of them are Republicans. In 2014, that election, the unconstitutional election I was talking about, following that, I think only 20% of House members were Democrat. I mean, it was 80% Republican. And it's not just sort of the situation we had even 5 years ago, where Republicans were essentially 2 parties. There were more traditional, moderate Republicans, and then you know, and really like, when I say moderate too in this, I mean conservative, right? But like it was just more traditional, like they still wanted schools to be funded. And then you have the more sort of fringe origin from the Tea Party and other things like that, very far-right Republicans. And now it has become where far-right Republicans are the dominant. It's not just that there's a supermajority of Republicans, it's that all the positions of power, like the speaker and president and majority leaders, are extremely far right, and the majority of their legislative body is. And so it's not just, you know, Republicans, it's sort of like what was even 5 years ago considered fringe. For example, Senate President Ty Masterson, he had run against Susan Wagle to be president when Susan Wagle became the president of the Kansas Senate again in 2016. And Senator Ty Masterson was considered too fringe and extreme for even Republicans, right? Like even in the Senate, and now he's the Senate president. And actually something I didn't mention earlier, but something that I think gets into this too, is that, you know, I've witnessed over the last like decade of being here, and especially the last like 7 years of really being in the State House, the rapid breakdown of legislative norms. And really, like, the Kansas legislature is a broken institution now. I mean, we have, where even if you, like, there are efforts that chairs will make it so that, like, the public does not even know that a bill hearing is gonna be happening. It's already hard enough for any regular person to be able to track a bill and know when to come to Topeka. If they're, getting to Topeka, a whole other issue, be able to come there to speak on an issue they care about. Now you have it where bills are constantly reshuffled and bundled into each other. So, I have situations where I'm tracking a bill, and again, this is what I do. And over the course of a year, a policy is put under like 4 or 5 different bill numbers. No way in the world that, like, even a regularly engaged person could track that. Whenever Senate President Ty Masterson was asked about this like a year or 2 ago, he's like, people don't care about bill numbers. It's like, but that's the only way that people can track this stuff. You have people like Senator Stephan, who has explicitly said he wouldn't even announce what bills are going to get on hearings like the next morning, because he didn't want people who oppose the bill to even be able to come and speak on the record about the bill. You have even like the late night sessions where just wild stuff happens. Legislators have no clue what they're even voting on because they're being kept there into the wee hour. They come in at 7 a.m. and they're there till 2 a.m. the next night, being asked to vote on rapid packages of bills sometimes. And all of this sort of breakdown of norms and of access, legislators, many of them won't meet with constituents anymore. Or what we saw following 2020 is, particularly we saw the Republican Party of Kansas essentially advising candidates not to go to any forum, not to go to any debate. And in Johnson County, they saw a wave of Republican candidates who had committed to them pull out of debates and then stop responding to anything, where the strategy became, don't actually talk to people, don't actually engage in debate, don't actually let people know your policies, just let our political action groups send attack mailers against your opponent to win. Which is this whole other breakdown of civic thing that combines, again, with the gerrymandering and other things. So already you picked your voters. Already, you design your district so you could win. You don't go to forums and engage with the public because the public doesn't even have a way to hold you accountable if you did. But also, groups like Americans for Prosperity, which is essentially Koch money, Koch family money. As long as you vote how they want, they'll dump, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars into these small races. I mean, I'm talking about a state representative race representing like 20,000 people, right? And all of a sudden you'll have, or a state senate race, like, 70,000 people, and all of a sudden you see like $300,000 of outside money come in and attack mailers against a candidate, against their opponent to secure their win. And so it's a whole other thing about campaign financing when we're out, but this also came about, and where the supermajorities in Kansas got stronger was following 2010, was following the Citizen United U.S. Supreme Court case, which unleashed unlimited corporate, dark, untraceable money into our political scene. Kansas being home to the Koch family, the Koch brothers at the time, just saw a wave of that money come in, and that's like what established the conservative supermajorities we even have today. I know a moderate Republican who was running for re-election in 2020 and he lost, and I talked to him about it, and he was telling me how he's like, yeah, the person running against me who won, they didn't come to any public forum, they're not involved in the community, they don't do anything here, but like Americans for Prosperity, he was like, every single day for like the 2 weeks leading the election, everyone in my district got an attack mailer, and he was like, Davis, if I just got these mailers, like, I wouldn't vote for me, right? But they can say whatever. There's no claims or anything. They can lie, which is this whole other bizarre thing where we actually see mailers where everything on it is just verifiably false.
Can't you
But there's
sue?
no, because you're a public official. Like defamation works differently in this context. And so, or that's my understanding of it. I'm not a lawyer. That's not legal advice. But you actually see just like blatant lies being said. But there's nothing to really counteract that. And in small towns, especially with the decline of local journalism, there's often nothing to confront that or even call that out. Pardon my language, right? But some of the shadiest shit that happens in the state is happening in small towns every election cycle. I mean, I know about churches that are using church money to like print political campaign stuff for candidates,
saw that
which is,
abortion, right?
which is not legal. That is illegal, right?
That's what I
we
said.
have a city state senator that that used essentially his church as part of like his campaigning efforts. Like we have all sorts of incredibly, either glaringly illegal or at best ethically like dubious things going on. And now we also, our ethics commission, which is like the sort of last thing we have for ethics and monitors campaign finance, is essentially under assault right now. I mean, they're trying to like shut it down. There was an interim committee over the last 2 days in Topeka about it. Conservatives have been trying to just essentially shut down our campaign ethics department and are trying to, there's an argument right now that like we shouldn't have campaign finance laws. Like they shouldn't disclose who donates or how much or anything, all this stuff. It's just free speech.
Wow.
Anyone can give to campaigns and no one's never know about it.
This actually came up even at the forum Monday night here at the library for the candidates for the city commission. One of the candidates talked about your vote being bought, and if you look around town at where the signs are up, I only see one candidate's signs up now.
Davis.
Devers in my.
I mean, that Beverly.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that anything against him. He was very, he was very.
He did a good job.
He did a very good job.
But yes, money helps.
Well, very difficult to run without money, yes.
So in opposition to the power of money, we're looking at the power of people.
Yes.
Turnout, and we wanna have a hopeful note here about, fighting this, and how can we support Loud Light and the work that's happening, especially with organizing across the college campuses and engaging in more civic discourse.
All right, so I would say I am actually, it depends on the day, but I'm actually incredibly optimistic about what's possible in Kansas and what's already happened in Kansas. I should say that, while we've been fighting this fight on voter suppression front, happy to report that this legislative session, we were able to stop every proposed voter suppression bill from becoming law in Kansas. Incredible. And not only that, actually there were some voting laws that got passed that were actually good reforms, like to clarify things about recounts, like all the drama we had around the recount of the abortion amendment and stuff. So there was some proactive policy that is good. The other thing is from I said 2014, this is where the year's data that I was looking at, and it was, I thought was egregious. From 2014 to 2018, Kansas saw the largest increase in youth turnout from those two elections in the nation. We had massive increase, and I think that even the laws to try to stop us from registering voters and stuff, though the reason we're seeing those wave again is because it's effective, because they're seeing how these tactics of engaging people are creating a more real democracy and they don't like it, and so they're fighting us. So that's the reason these fights are hard. But something else that I think ties into all this too is like, young people understanding sort of political parties and deciding who you're going to vote for and researching candidates. These all can be complicated and difficult things. Most people are really motivated by issues, right? The first step actually isn't usually getting registered to vote. The first step is getting passionate about an issue, right? It's someone who, maybe something happened at your kid's school and you think your kid was really wrong, and so you find out about the school board and you're like, someone needs to change a policy about this, and no one cares about it, and so you're like, how do I get
how do I register to vote? How do I get other people registered to vote? Maybe I'm gonna run for the candidate. Like, often people's beginning is not in the sort of civic bureaucracy. It's in being mobilized by an issue and feeling hope that they can have an impact and change that issue. And so with that, actually on the abortion amendment, we saw Loud Light Civic Action, which is our C4. We have a C3 and C4, much like Women for Kansas have their foundation in the organization. We had a program called Vote Nay, which was about, that was a really daunting and really sort of terrifying experience waiting for that vote, right? Like, is half of our population about to lose the civil right to control their body? Yeah, I mean, that was terrifying. You can't emphasize that enough. But for a lot of people, you get terrified and you get that feeling. And again, it's so easy to either give into sort of, anger and violence, or also just despair and hopelessness, to not want to get out of bed, to feel really frozen because something bad happens. And Vote Nay was an effort by some of our young organizers and led by Risha Nazir, who's now at KU Law School, was from Wichita, who, to make this a sort of joyful, or to take this terrible experience and make it joyful. And it was like, I mean, with pink cowboy hats and all like glamorous and goofy, and they were like, really big on like TikTok. And they had things like, we did events like Ponies to the Polls, where we'd have actual like horses out at things. They had like block parties and bands playing, and they would do phone banks that were really just geared towards like, young people or young women of color, so that they just had a community connection to like make new friends that cared about this issue. And it became this joyful organizing experience. So it took the most terrifying thing they were experiencing and turned it into something that they could belong to, this new effort, and build meaningful friendships. And also, again, these things are not one-off. You're planting seeds that, like, you see the sprouts and growths of them sometimes decades later, of how, we have fellowships that we do for leadership development that are in the spring. We bring usually, around a dozen young people into a semester-long program, and we teach them about the state legislature, and they follow it week by week, and we talk about college students. So all of our stuff's geared towards folks 18 and over. Again, just because capacity, because they can vote, and because capacity, and because there's a whole other variety of legal issues you have to worry about whenever you're dealing with folks under 18.
I understand.
So we bring them in, engage them in the legislative process, teach them how to give testimony or write op-eds. In the summer, we do community organizing, where it's really about your local community. What issue are you passionate about in your local community? How would you make a change? And helping them to build a plan for what would it look like to actually build that community change and see your end result. And then in the fall, we do an electoral focus program, which is often about, normally be heavily about voter registration. Now it's mostly just about get out the vote and building a culture around organizing. We just had a big, across campuses, having pizza parties and asking people to pledge to vote. And again, it's not just the end result, it's the community that you're building. When you do that, when you bring people together with a shared mission, you're building lifelong relationships. Some of the young people we work with, they find their best friend in life through this work. They build their community through doing this work together. There's sort of no solidarity like being in the trenches together in a fight. And so it's building these more robust communities. And especially for young people, when I first got here, every young person I talked to was like, I can't wait to get the hell out of Kansas. And now, all the time, through our fellowships and the young people we work with, I watch young people come in with that perspective, and they leave or end up staying with us or working with us because they were like, no, I want to be in Kansas. I believe in what we're doing here. I believe in the change we're making here. I believe that I can be a part of mobilizing people and making that change. And so, I don't know. Anyways, all of it's amazing, and it's all multifaceted. There's no one sort of magic bullet to doing anything of this. It's all of it.
for our work. You know, you can donate and support at loudlight.org/donate. You can sign up to become a monthly donor of any amount. That's extremely helpful. You can also sign up there to be on our email list, so you get the weekly recap videos in your email. If we have an event going on in your community, like the candidate forum here or something else, you'll get emails about that. And you'll get emails about things like, you know, whenever really big things are happening in the state house, that might be like, for example, we did a lot of stuff around redistricting. Particularly Lawrence knows this so well, how y'all were so egregiously carved into the big one. Literally, the entire district just reaches over and pulls y'all in.
We're gonna flip it, it's gonna happen.
Yeah, so those are really just getting involved here, and then, you know, signing up, being on our email list, following us on all of our social media. Financial support is always really appreciated. And then on a broader level, you know, doing the work that y'all already do. Like, I've known Women for Kansas for many years now, spoken at a lot of the different groups across the state and the state events. Continuing to build this and bring folks in, because a lot of the work we're doing is the same stuff. And then really my only sort of unique twist on this too is to really, with younger folks, being really intentional about trying to bring them in and give them leadership roles. Like, not just bring folks in to like observe, but to have leadership roles and experiences, and to understand that, like, you know, they have things to offer that you don't, and you have things to offer that they don't, right? That building this better community, this beloved place in Kansas, like, takes all of us understanding that each of us has a unique experience and perspective to bring to this table, and until we build sort of more solidarity across all of this, across all of issues, you know, if it's reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, labor rights, access to education, access to clean water, which is why that's something that we're still constantly fighting all across the state for, that all of us need to do a better job of showing up for each other so that people can too show up for us. Yeah.
Wow.
Were there any other questions?
I actually wanted to introduce myself. This is my first time in Lawrence, because I'm actually with the Wichita chapter.
Oh, nice.
I'm an intern with Women for Kansas. I'm a social work major at Bethel College in Newton. And my goal that the Wichita chapter has set up for me by the time I graduate is to restart the Newton chapter of Women for Kansas with a younger population of voters. And I've actually wanted to join Love Life for a long time. I haven't known how, and so that's actually why I drove here today, is I want to work with Love Light to kind of just get resources, like help start the new chapter up. And I want to do policy and advocacy social work. And so, yeah, that's what I drove here for today. So how do I get, because I'm sure there's a Wichita Loud Light group. How do I get involved, like, physically?
So to physically get involved, I would say, well, first, like, sign up and stuff so we have you on our list. And then just like email us. I would say I am pretty sure that it would be, you can always email just like info@loudlight.org. But Logan is one of our full-time employees who's based in, and she's based in Wichita. So I think it's just Logan, Logan, @loudlight.org. And if you email her and also like let her know that you saw me and we talked and that you want to be involved, because she's not just organizing in Wichita, but also like in Hutchinson, and I think in Newton too, where it makes sense, like that sort of whole area. And we love Bethel College. Yeah, I know some professors there, and I love social workers. I talk to social workers all the time.
Yeah, I love it there too.
Yeah, what year are you?
I'm a senior, so
Cool.
yeah, it's my senior internship project, I guess.
Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah, email her, and also if she doesn't get back to you or anything, like email info, because I also check that. And we can get you connected, because yeah, I would love to collaborate on that. Love Bethel.
Good question. I heard recently that we love our county clerk here, Jimmy, she's amazing. So, but I heard recently that if Lawrence grows above, or Douglas County grows above like 125,000 or something, the state, Secretary of State, will pick our county clerk?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
That's a negative incentive.
What did you guys know
Um,
that? I never heard this. How did they not know this?
That's just ridiculous. Wow.
So tell
So,
us about this.
This is actually, okay. So this is, I forgot the exact number, but basically, so in Kansas, there is, there's 105 counties, and there is a threshold that was set for when a county, right now, elections for counties are run by your county clerk, which means that they are responsible for so much stuff. This is a wild situation in small towns, in small counties, where you have a county of 2,000 people, and like the county clerk has to do all of like sort of the tax assessment evaluations and property tax notices to people, and they have to do all sorts of like filings and things like that, and they're supposed to run elections. But if you're in a big county and the population threshold, there's essentially a couple conflicting numbers in statute, which they tried to clean up in a bill this year, and that actually is one point where I didn't love, but there was not clarity, but we've had for a long time a threshold where once your county becomes so big, the county clerk no longer runs elections, and you get an election commissioner that is appointed by the Secretary of State.
Right.
And that's how like Johnson County has it, that's how Shawnee County has it, Topeka, that's how Sedgwick County, Wichita has it. And that's how Wyandotte has it. And Douglas County is close to the threshold. Again, I forgot the exact amount. But how it would normally happen is it'd be during the census. Like, so every 10 years, once the census comes in, if you pass the threshold, you would then is when it would happen, right? That's when they would say, you're past the population threshold. Now you no longer, your county clerk doesn't do it, the Secretary of State appoints your election commissioner. Which, by the way, the Secretary of State appoints the election commissioner, but the county commission still has to fund all the election stuff, so it's sort of a very weird system that creates tension because the commissioner works for the Secretary of State, but they have to get all their budget approved from the county commission, and there's all sorts of drama that happens there. But Douglas County is relatively close to the threshold, and in this new bill that passed, I guess I should say this was the one controversial part of one of the bigger bills that got passed. It was mostly a major cleanup bill because some statutes, some state laws conflicted with each other, and it was bad. I was like, the Secretary of State, during the recount stuff last year, I was like, it's arguable that how all this stuff is happening is illegal. But it's also unclear because our state law is just hodgepodge in this area, so they were trying to clean it up. And they wanted to clean up a section where there were different population thresholds set to make this adjustment in law. And unfortunately, part of like the compromise that went in is it will now be, I think, not just the census every 10 years, it will be sort of like, again, don't quote me on this, but I think it's now like once whatever the state estimate is for your county, it will happen. So there's a chance in the next like handful of years that Douglas County could fall into that threshold, and then GBSU would no longer be responsible for elections, and the Secretary of State would appoint an election commissioner, and then an election department would be formed in the county to run your elections.
But the county clerk would still be an elected position, but
Yes.
not the election commission part of the county clerk's office.
Yes, that's right. It would become all elections would become its complete own thing. There have been pushes over the years to change this to make, if they are gonna do this, where you have the election office, to make it an elected position in the state legislature. That hasn't really gotten anywhere, but I can also get y'all more details on the exact thing, or you could ask Jamie Shu, because I remember talking with him some about this as the bill was going through, because Jamie Shu is brilliant. I'm a big fan. But that is something that could happen, and I would say, I know in the last couple appointments, the Secretary of State, Scott Schwab, has tried to make it where there's like a team to select it, where it's not just him, sort of like Kobach did, where Kobach would just handpick like, you know, a friend who goes to church with them, like to be here. I think the Secretary of State has tried to make it where like the county commissioners of the county sit on a board and some like community representative has tried to make like a group do the selection. But again, I don't know all the exact details, but it's something to keep an eye on.
Sure. Well, I think we're, thank you. At the end of our time. Thank you so much. Loudlight.org/donate.
Yeah, I'd like that.
And Donovan is our Lawrence.
Yes, yeah. And Donovan is a Lawrence person, and you'll see him if you go to the
Forums.
forums this afternoon.
Very
Yeah.
good. Okay, I hope to meet you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, has Kobach